Okay, we will kick off, and I'd like to say welcome to everyone, to let you know you can make as many rude gesticulations as you like, because we can't see a thing from up here. So if you are trying to prompt us, it's not gonna help. No, don't encourage them, Rohan. What you can do, of course, is post questions in the app. You should all now be well practiced at that, given it's the afternoon session. So please remember that's how you can give questions to the panel. Okay, we're going to kick off, and if anything has made you depressed so far, then talking about the interrelated challenges of biodiversity and climate will certainly do the job. I think we've seen this through the IPBES joint report with the IPCC, where we finally had acknowledgement, I think, of what we all know damn well on the ground, which of course is it's a system. And climate change and biodiversity loss are interrelated challenges that we face. We also saw that with some of the figures that were put up with the World Economic Forum's global risk analysis, where we can see in the top risks how much both climate change and biodiversity loss are figuring and increasing. So what we're going to do today is not talk about the reality of what we're confronting, but we're going to talk about the reality of great stuff that's happening on the ground. We're going to talk about solutions that we're seeing in practice. And we have 4 panel members to help us with this. And each one of them has a great example or case study that can bring to us some lessons about what is possible and what is working. So we'll bring the panel together, and we've decided collectively that we want to make this a bit more of an interactive discussion with each other too, because this is a great opportunity for us to learn from each other as well. So we won't be just giving long presentations. We'll be turning this into more of a conversation between panel members. Now, before we kick off more officially, I also want to acknowledge traditional owners, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the lands upon which we are actually meeting. I also want to acknowledge traditional owners and custodians around the country with which we have the honour of working with on a daily basis in the work that we all do as conservation environment organisations. I also want to acknowledge that it is a pretty tough time this week for a lot of people, and explain that allies of Indigenous organisations and elders, that we're still here, and that we acknowledge the strength of people, and that we are here to work with people into the future and those pathways. And I think what we'll be talking about today will be very relevant with regards to those shared pathways and how we find solutions. Okay, my intro. I don't need to tell you about myself, but I'm CEO of NRM Regions Australia, which is the peak body for the 54 regional NRM organisations around the country. Happy to chat with any of you about that in any detail after the session. But I do want to actually move on to our panel and have a chat with them now about what we're doing, talk a little bit about examples, and then get into the guts of it. So I'm going to pick first on Rohan, who I've had the fortune of knowing for some years now. So Rohan is Finance Director for Regen Farmers Mutual, and he's here because of a project they've done, which is native woodland biodiversity credits. So I'm going to ask Rohan just to give us a couple of minutes, not on the whole project, but just give us an update on biodiversity credits and where they're at.
Thanks, Kate. Yep, on. So I'm Rohan Clarke. I'm from Regen Farmers Mutual. We're a farmer-owned company helping farmers to understand what they can do to deliver better environmental and economic outcomes, basically. And so in terms of biodiversity, we've riffing off the last session, which was talking about the emerging TNFD flowing down to financial reporting, we're seeing the emergence of corporate interest in biodiversity. And I see this as part of the Biodiversity Conservation Credits Alliance, an international body, and as part of the World Economic Forum panel. And there's the interesting thing that's coming up is the World Economic Forum is holding a biodiversity credit auction in the second quarter of next year. And that represents a great opportunity for basically, globally for us to understand what a biodiversity credit market might look like what the guardrails are that we might need to set in place, and what corporate demand might there be. And so in preparation for that, we're actually putting together a native woodlands credit, and that native woodlands credit has come out of a project that we undertook in the Trap Rock in Queensland. And so that basically identified that there was an opportunity to help farmers protect and restore boxgum grassy woodland in that location, but all the way down the east coast. You know, there's 3.5 million hectares of boxgum grassy woodland left. There once was 90 million, so it's a critically endangered species. And so that's the project we're putting forward to the biodiversity credit auction, and that's probably the most interesting thing coming up in that space that we're aware of anyway.
Thank you. That's great. And just heads up that we'll be asking you in more detail about that and some of the lessons you've learned. Stella. So Stella Kondylas is the blue carbon lead for the Australia program for the Nature Conservancy. And so, of course, I'm going to ask Stella, what is blue carbon?
Thanks, Kate. So the Nature Conservancy has very ambitious is a global organisation that has very ambitious biodiversity and climate change targets. And with Australia having 12% of our blue carbon ecosystems globally, it makes sense for us to be looking at blue carbon here in Australia. So what is blue carbon? Blue carbon is the carbon that's captured and stored in coastal ecosystems, so in mangroves, salt marsh and seagrass meadows. So these ecosystems can capture and store larger amounts of carbon than terrestrial forest areas, and if undisturbed can actually last, the carbon can last in the sediment for thousands of years. So this makes it a really important natural climate solution for us to be looking at. Globally, we've lost a lot of coastal areas. Here in Australia, a lot of the areas have been drained for agriculture, also for salt production. So important work for us here. Last year, the Clean Energy Regulator released the first new blue carbon method, and that allows for land managers or landowners to implement an intervention that allows for tidal reconnection and tidal flow back to properties, and therefore register for carbon credits.
Perfect. Thank you. Lyall, your turn for the quick overview. Now, you're with the Invasive Species Council, yep, and you're the Conservation and Biosecurity Analyst, is that right? Yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I want to ask you, with regards to invasive species, there's quite a nexus, isn't there, between climate change and invasive species. So tell us a little about that.
Thanks, Kate. Yes, there definitely is a nexus. Sadly, it's the saddest competition. It shouldn't be a competition, but climate change, habitat loss and invasive species are all competing to be the worst threat to our biodiversity. Unfortunately, in Australia, invasive species are the #1 threat to our species. It's happening immediately, it's urgent, and action needs to happen now. Climate change is only going to exacerbate that, make it more difficult. Invasive species are the climate change winners in the world, and it's really a very concerning situation that we have. They go into places quicker, they spread more rapidly. Any kind of environmental disturbance is great for invasive species. They're very adaptable. They have a broad range, and the costs of eradication and control is just getting more and more out of control. That report that you mentioned, the UN released that report, was a really good moment for us to really focus on this problem, and it shows us that globally $400 billion a year is spent on control and impacts from invasives, and in Australia it's caused 80% of our vertebrate extinctions, and we think that it's going to cause the next wave of vertebrate extinctions as well, let alone invertebrates, plants, those sorts of stats are still to be found. Just to switch it into a bit more positive, we have a lot of things happening at the moment. We're trying to work with a lot of different campaigns at the moment, but some of the good news stories, one of them being the island conservation and eradications that are happening, and they are really good demonstration of how we can actually succeed against these feral animals, and they are going to be the havens for our threatened species once climate change does make it necessary that we need to put them there. But we can't do that unless we eradicate the invasives first. And another thing that we're doing that is a positive thing is incorporating everybody into biosecurity to protect the environment, and one of those things is citizen science. So I'll go into more detail about that later, but 2-minute wrap-up of the nexus, I guess.
Perfect, thanks, Lyall. And you missed the opportunity to say that here in the national capital, of course, we're also the national capital for rabbits, it appears, yes. Which I sort of find quite ironic. But it's good for food security too, don't you think, into the future? So I think you've got it nailed, Canberra. Okay, Doug. Over to you. I hope I haven't stolen your thunder. Doug is Chief Conservation Scientist for Trust for Nature. Moving on from rabbits, Doug, would you like to talk to us a little bit about what you're doing? And I think it's individual landholders and the role they can play and how they can contribute, yes?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yes, so I work with Trust for Nature. So we're a statutory body in Victoria that works with landholders to protect habitat on private land, mostly in perpetuity. So we've now got more than 1,500 landholder agreements across the state, which together with the land that Trust for Nature owns and manages for conservation sort of totals about 110,000 hectares of land. But I see the work that we do in the context of tackling climate change and biodiversity loss as being a sort of explicit demonstration of that principle that you need to think universally but act locally. So I guess our core message is that individual landholders, by their actions in managing threats to biodiversity, also help mitigate the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, on their individual properties. But we need to think about how we can sort of bundle up those individual efforts into sort of strategic outcomes for both nature conservation and climate change mitigation. So just as an example, across the 110,000 hectare estate that we collectively manage with landholders, and in our own right, we now currently store 4.3 million tonnes of carbon in the native vegetation on those land areas. So I guess that's the work that I think about at the strategic level, and then our regional teams really work with individual landholders who are making that voluntary pledge to nature in perpetuity. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. And because you talked about that strategic level, I'm going to surprise the panel by jumping forward to one of my pre-prepared questions. I promise I'll come back to number one and talk about the landscape level, because I know this is relevant to the work that all of you do. And Doug, you said that we need to, in a sense, bring this stuff up to that level where we're actually getting that strategic impact. So I'll actually kick off with you, but I'd love something from all of you if you wish, on why the landscape level is important for dealing with the interrelated challenges of biodiversity and climate change.
So in a timely way, we've just recently published our statewide conservation plan that will take us to 2030. And I guess the way we've thought about conservation at that statewide scale this time was really to think about how can we adapt to climate change impacts. And we really thought about the National Reserve System program's principle of adequacy and the need to protect sufficient areas of land to ensure that you maintain the viability and integrity of ecosystems, species and populations in the context of climate change. And I kind of think, bringing that back to a simple statement, if we're not thinking about how we maintain ecosystem or keep ecosystems healthy and species healthy, and that requires a kind of landscape level of planning, then we're failing. So the way we've addressed that is to identify our 18 focal landscapes across Victoria where we think we've got the best opportunities to ensure that we keep healthy ecosystems and healthy species in the face of a changing climate. And I guess to give a sense of their impact, they represent about 18% of Victoria's private land, but we're getting a 3-fold to 5-fold benefit in terms of the underrepresented vegetation, the priority fauna species, and the climate change refuges that we've mapped within those landscapes. So that's where we intend to invest about 50% of our conservation effort over the next decade.
Okay, and I think that leads well to native woodlands and the landscape level and why you're working on what you're working on with the credits. So do you want to pick up on what Doug has said and tell us a bit about landscape in this instance?
And how it translates into what we're doing. So 100% agree with Doug, the idea of understanding the landscape impact is and what the key things that can be done in a particular landscape. So we work, one of the things that, there's kind of two dimensions. One is the environmental, the difference between a biodiversity in Ireland and a biodiversity corridor. Landholders working together can deliver a bigger impact than they can in isolation. So that much is kind of self-evident. So the other side to it is that we've come to understand that it's working with groups that, so there's a social dynamic. That by working with groups, you can kind of trigger actions because through collective, and not necessarily peer group pressure, but it's peer group understanding and learning. So in the Trap Rock in Queensland, where we first came to understand this problem about boxgum grassy woodland, we took a group of farmers through it was supposed to be a 20-week program. It took us a bit longer, where we asked that question: what can you do individually, but what also can you do collectively in that landscape that would deliver the best environmental outcome and the economic outcome as a farmer that you require. So delivering both an economic and an environmental profit. And through that process, they were able to discover for themselves that it was, we can protect and restore boxgum grassy woodland. And the way that we could do that from when you restore boxgum, or when you protect and restore boxgum grassy woodland, you can still farm it. You can still have your lambs being grazing in that land, so it still can be a productive landscape, but it can also be qualified for, in some circumstances, an avoided clearing carbon project, and we can deliver biodiversity outcomes. So they came to understand that there was potentially environmental market transactions that could incentivise them to undertake these actions. And so that was a long-winded way of saying, well, what we've come to understand is there's the environmental impacts, but then if you can trigger these social dynamics where you get groups of farmers to come together and learn from each other, then that's a great way to kind of deliver landscape outcomes.
I have always said that you're a natural regional NRME person because that's pretty much what regional natural resource management organisations do. So yes, agree entirely that it's the landscape and it's the social, and particularly in light of biodiversity and climate change, individual action is not going to be sufficient. We really do have to be working collectively and together. So thank you for explaining that with that particular example. Do you want to bite back, or shall I pass on?
Well, it was interesting. Sorry, there was one other element to it. It's like, how do you make it economic in that region to educate those farmers? So finding that model where you've got local expertise that can support those farmers on that journey to understand what they're doing is also an interesting question. And again, it leads to that group dynamic. That if you're dealing one-on-one, if you're trying to deal with a farmer one-on-one, someone can't create a business around providing that advice. But if you're dealing with groups of farmers, then someone can develop the expertise to support that region. So whether they're part of an NRM or independent consultant. So anyway.
Yeah, and it's going to take all. And I actually go back to David Pocock's point about the necessity for government investment in all of this too, because it is always going to be a public-private partnership. And for some of the public good elements and the social capital work that we require, there's going to have to be some element of government investment to then enable those sorts of processes, and upon which one can build those economic or private sector opportunities as well. Sorry, that was me getting on my soapbox. I'll jump off now. Stella, we will go to you before Lyall. I guess my question then around landscapes is, how does this relate to blue carbon and coastal areas, etc.? What's the relevance?
Sure, thanks, Kate. So really scaling climate change and biodiversity solutions will be essential. and our projects, and particularly the project in South Australia. So the Nature Conservancy is working in a number of areas on pilot sites currently, and that's a focus on tidal reconnection. But we also recognise that applying that landscape scale approach across private and public land is really essential. So the project in South Australia is 12,000 hectares. Within that, we are restoring a couple of hundred hectares with regards to tidal reconnection. So, and the reason we've approached it that way is protection and restoration are both essential. And so we have the public land, which is the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary National Park, Wenatchee Pankara, and there's a number of partners working with us in this space, including Ghana as the traditional owners. And we are working across boundaries. So we have a landscape restoration plan in place, and we have undertaken landholder visits with private landholders, and we're also engaging with national parks around what landscape scale activities can we do in there to protect the blue carbon ecosystems. And unless we do that, there's no use restoring one area without addressing some of the threats to the surrounding landscape. So scale matters, connectivity obviously really important and vital. And with blue carbon ecosystems, there's so many co-benefits from these ecosystems. So it's not just biodiversity, so shorebirds, migratory shorebirds, vital for nursery grounds for fish and crabs, coastal protection from flooding and inundation, and water filtration as well. So really important for us to take that landscape scale approach.
Great, thank you. Lyall, and maybe you could bring in that discussion about the social and environmental aspects of landscape that Rohan kicked off.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really good point. There's a lot to talk about there. I'll just quickly touch on the thing that you said before about the resilience in environment. I think that's something that's really front and centre in our thinking, in that when we're talking about these invasive species and the efforts to try to reduce their numbers and eradicate them from important places, it's all about that. It's protecting the resilience of the ecosystem in the face of changes that are coming. And if you have changing climates and affecting ecosystems that are already under incredible stress and incredible pressure from all of these feral animals and diseases that are there, it's just a downward slope. So it's exacerbating each other. So it's just another reason why that's really, really critical. But yes, what you said about the across the landscape view and incorporating different people, that's something that is quite critical when it comes to invasive species management, because there are so many different legislative frameworks and different states versus federal remit, private land, public land, crown land. All of them have a different way of dealing with invasives, which will then lead to the way that we adapt to the changes coming. And one of the things that we've been working on is trying to bring the general public into biosecurity. And one of the things that we're doing is a trial run called the Bug Hunt, where we're just getting everybody out there looking for insects, anything that they see, just to give more data for environmental purposes, but letting them know that they're actually doing a surveillance service for biosecurity. They're looking out for things that shouldn't be there, and it's just getting everybody aware of what environmental biosecurity means, because traditionally it's just been a protecting agricultural productivity kind of traditional approach, but it's actually so much more than that. Our environment is protected by that system, and it's important that everybody knows that. One final thing I'll just quickly mention is just going back to again that discussion about the regional space and why it's so important. We've got feral deer in Tasmania at the moment that are running out of control. It's a terrible, terrible situation, and there's control going on in the World Heritage Area in Tasmania with government funding, but there's no point in investing so much money and effort in doing that if they're only going to re-invade from the neighbouring land, which isn't under the federal government remit. You know, the Midlands region has one of the worst populations of feral deer in Australia, and there's no control. I mean, they're protected as a game animal in that region, which is personally just ridiculous. But you have all these different factors at play that mean that regional approaches are just so important, but it means talking to everybody, and I mean everybody involved. And we are all involved in biosecurity.
It's sad, isn't it? Because some of it is so self-obvious. And I remember
it's a simple
decades
solution.
ago, working in regional NRM in Central Australia with a pastoralist saying, well, water and pigs don't stop at the border. like, duh.
You're right.
They're not going to recognise the Queensland border.
Yep.
So clearly we have to work across all of those borders. Once again, brings us back to landscape scale. But also, I do think sometimes we should move on from the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, to the IS principle. It's a system, stupid. Because in so many ways, the social ecological system that we're actually working with is so apparent in what you're all saying. So thank you for that. I also think that helps us move on to the third question, and I'll come back to the first one at the very end, because this is about partnerships. And we've got behind us Unite for Nature. So quite clearly, this conference is about uniting and is about those partnerships. But I want to ask specifically what partnerships you think are particularly important or relevant when we're bringing together biodiversity and climate change and finding solutions for that. And how do we actually make those partnerships work? Because each one of you has touched upon partnerships in achieving what you've achieved in your work and your projects. So who would like to kick off? And I actually want a genuine answer, an example of those partnerships for bringing together these challenges and actually how you make it work in your projects. Lyall, you can start if you've got the mic.
I've got the mic, I might as well. And I did just mention the project that we have running, the Bug Hunt. So that is about getting biosecurity surveillance in part of the communities, getting communities out there looking for things. I think I'll just take one quick step back and just say that it goes to concepts of what we call shared culture, shared responsibility, general biosecurity duty. They're all principles that get talked about a lot in strategies and sort of big statements. But we want to actually see how that works on the ground and how it involves actual people. It's all well and good to talk about, under a massive national strategy that we're all going to be working collaboratively and sharing in the culture. But that doesn't really mean much on the ground. So a good model to look at is our neighbours, New Zealand. They have programs for biosecurity in their society, and they don't even call it biosecurity. The name for their program is Kotatau. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, apologies. But it literally means this is us, and that's the branding. This is us. It's biosecurity, but they don't talk about that word. And what it means to be a New Zealander is to care for your natural environment. And they have terrible feral animal problems. Some of them are from Australia, wallabies and possums, which is an interesting one. But yeah, that's their identity, is that they're all out there, they all look, they all see what it is, they own that identity. It's something that we could be doing in Australia. We all are passionate and love our country and love the animals that live within it, but I don't think it's very common for the general public to know what they can do individually. So what we're doing with the insect surveillance is that we're trying to identify all the different community groups that are already out there on the land doing regen, doing bush care, doing stream watch, and just telling them that you're already out there in the environment. You're our first line of surveillance if you are looking, if you know what to look for. And we keep hoping that we're going to see zeros, and that's difficult to motivate people. But what we're doing is making it a fun search that you can find whatever interesting bugs that you like and report them. And that helps us with biodiversity data, with conservation data for invertebrates, and it's a surveillance mechanism that brings people in, and it also makes people sort of feel part of the system. It's part of, they're protecting biodiversity, they're helping with the resilience of the ecosystems, they're watching out for the next thing that could cause the pressure and the damage, and they feel a bit of ownership on it.
It's an interesting one too, though, isn't it? Because it's that whole cycle that we need to make sure we have in place as well, which is a different form of partnership, because, of course, surveillance is nothing if we don't then have response.
Absolutely right.
Yep. The deer are a classic example, yes, when we've actually been watching deer populations grow for quite some time and spread in Australia. And
there's lots of roles that government play, and they have to play that, but it's not everything. So, yeah. So a great example, thank you. Who'd like to pick up on Lyall's talk about partnerships and... Yep.
Well, I'll pick up on Minister Plibersek's announcement this morning, because I think that gives us a pretty neat example of a partnership where, thanks really to the Nature Conservancy coming to Trust for Nature and offering a generous philanthropic contribution to Plains Wanderer conservation, that has led us to leverage funds from both the federal government and Victorian government. And I guess it is that kind of collaboration and co-investment that is critical with private land conservation. But beyond that, I'd also go then those funds rely, as I said earlier, on the goodwill of individual landholders. So there is so much work done by many agencies and organisations and the community to encourage landholders to think that they've got something important on their land. And as you were saying, Rohan, find ways in which they can continue to farm that land sustainably while having nature conservation outcomes. But yeah, I would like to thank the Nature Conservancy, Stella, is brilliant.
Thank you. I can continue on with the partnership discussion. So partnerships are obviously vital, and in the blue carbon space in particular, I'd like to just outline in terms of partnerships, different partners bring different strengths and can play different roles in projects. And so we have, with a particular project in South Australia, we have 8 other partners, and it was really important for us to have natural resource management involved, and they obviously bring a key strength in terms of engaging with landholders in that space and knowledge and that landscape approach. National parks, obviously, in terms of important landholders and important decision makers in that landscape. Our researchers, so our universities, so bringing monitoring skills to the fore, really there. Local government as well, in terms of decision making. They're making decisions on planning within that regional framework all the time, so that's vital. And of course the Department for Environment and Water in terms of some of the planning approvals and things there, they're also a key partner. BirdLife Australia, skills monitoring, obviously the importance of shorebirds, and they remind us around that and the importance of that work. BirdLife Australia, Birds SA as well. So really, but one I'd really like to highlight and just identify in terms of the importance of is our traditional owners. So Ghana are a central and vital partner for us, and they bring and they have been providing really strong leadership in this space within the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary for a number of years. They were instrumental in helping to identify and create the national park, but they've been providing really strong leadership and connection back into youth, but also in providing guidance on decision making and things as well. So just a really strong shout out to the elders involved right the way throughout the creation of the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary.
Perfect, Stella, because I think you managed to bring into your example public sector, private sector, civil society and traditional owners and Indigenous organisations. I don't know what the equivalent of triumvirate is for 4. I've been sitting here trying to figure it out, so any help sent through on the Q&A from anyone would be most welcome, but probably too late by then. But yes, I think having those 4 sectors in a sense, or areas, is fundamental to the work we do and achieving what we all achieve on the ground.
Kate, sorry, can I just add there, we had early investment through a corporate donor as well, so business coming to the table. They were the first smart group, the first to kind of invest in blue carbon as a business. Yep. And we've also since had government funding, but also foundation funding as well. So diversity of funding sources in the blue carbon space is really important, because that blended finance model is what's required for when we're in early stages of development, which we are in the blue carbon space. We need to reduce the risk, and a blended finance model has been essential for that. So
yeah, excellent points. I think we can follow up on some of that discussion too, and I suspect we'll get some questions as well, because I think it's the blended finance, but the blended expertise as well as the blended ownership of all of that across a landscape, so that integrated landscape approach as well, which of course is a fundamental principle of integrated catchment management and that sort of thing. But I also think what you talked about was the expertise that came to the table, and I think Lyall and Doug did as well. And so sometimes what people bring in the partnerships isn't necessarily the dollars, but the resources come in different forms, don't they? And I think sometimes we underestimate the expertise that people bring to the table. So what I'm hearing from you all too, and I'll come to Rohan, is also a respect for what people can bring to the table, So a respect for different forms of knowledges and understanding of country, and how important that then is for this sort of work. Rohan?
I honestly can't add much more in the sense of that's you've captured the essence of it. I guess when I love partnerships, talking about partnerships, I love the idea of thinking about alignment, how you go about aligning interests. And we kind of talk about a Venn diagram. You try and understand what your role is, what their role is, what their role is. And one of the advantages of being a farmer-owned vehicle is we have a very clear mandate. So it allows us to understand what our objective is and how we can best interact with others. So we found it very simple and easy to be able to engage, whether it's with government or with capital, because people know where we're coming from. And being a farmer-owned mutual, which means that we don't maximise profits we're maximising benefits for our members. It means that people understand that, members understand that we're being driven by their interests, and that therefore we're transparent, we use open source technology, we don't sign NDAs. All those things have enabled us to be able to enter into partnerships in a way that has been incredibly useful. But I don't think that's adding a hell of a lot more than...
I think it is, because to me, one of the reasons why I've followed Regen Farmers Mutual so closely is I think that issue about also having different models for how you do business. And I think the mutual model or the cooperative model, where the people engaged actually own the business, is one that Australia is quite familiar with. We've actually had farmers co-ops for well over 100 years, as well as others. So there's also a need for us to have those different forms of following through on partnerships. And I think mutuals or co-ops can be a different way of doing that. So once again, it brings that diversity into the mix in a way that can also be inclusive, but also something we haven't heard much discussion about, I think, over the course of today is that one about agency and power. I think we're quite shy of talking about those things directly, yet they're so damned important with regards to making change, particularly when change isn't always popular. So I think ways of sharing power and creating agency for people, and yours was a great example too, Lyall, because that's what you're doing with people on the ground with the bug system. Is helping get people have a sense of agency about their role to contribute. So all of you in different ways have also talked about that, but yours was in a very concrete business model about how you share power, how you actually share the benefits of this process and create agency for people to engage in something. And I think that is also a challenge when we're talking about, how we engage with public-private sector, because we have some quite... we have expectations about how those models work and what they then mean about power and agency and distribution of benefits, etc., etc. And that's also very relevant with regards our relationships with First Nations people in Australia too.
That's a great point. Sorry, in the Trap Rock we had this group of ultimately 14 pilot farmers, and the average age was 68, and there's gender roles at that type of age, so they're typically male. And the start of the process, they were, cautious, conservative, and through this, because they were answering the question, they were being led through this process. They had that agency. By the end of the process, they had discovered the answer, and the level of engagement, optimistic. And Monash Behaviour Works did a comparative study on the way through, looking at the level of engagement through this process versus the carbon and biodiversity government scheme, like in a different location, and it was just incredibly illustrative of what you were just describing. The fact that farmers felt like they had agency, they had bigger buy-in, and they were telling their neighbours, so that when we had that final session, we had a much bigger crowd there, and there's the next wave of farmers who are interested in participating.
Which is a really useful lesson. It's probably going to help us segue on. And a couple of comments I've made that I wouldn't mind adding later. We will segue on to lessons learned, but I think that is also a really useful lesson for government programs, because the Carbon Plus biodiversity trials were actually run through regional NRM organisations. But in the first instance, because there was a political hurry to it, we only had a few weeks, I think it was, to actually kick that off and design it, etc. So sometimes there's fabulously well-intentioned efforts that can come through government, but they can be stymied by the implementation process. So we really need to learn and make sure these lessons are actually applied to those sorts of processes as well. And I think it's also one that we've seen, unfortunately, in some of the carbon markets with regards, behaviour of some particular developers, etc. There's some great ones, but there's also some people have lost agency sometimes in those processes. So a really worthwhile one. Doug, are you happy if I move on? Because we do need to leave time for questions. Are you happy if I move on to lessons? Or do you want to quickly jump in on...
I just wanted to make the point about partnerships, because I also think it's worth thinking about partnerships in terms of place. So when you look at a landscape, different organisations, different land managers have different roles, and I still don't think we necessarily harness those opportunities as effectively as we could. So, and this is partly wearing jointly my Trust for Nature hat, but also being chair of a local land care group and recently looking at our local 40,000 hectare landscape, where the land care group has done, lots of habitat corridors through the 30 or 40 years of its life. But I can see them connecting the protected patches, and I kind of think those opportunities for partnership, and as you were saying, Lyall, we need to work at that scale for lots of invasives. And so I think those place-based partnerships and planning with all of the partners who manage land in a landscape is a way forward that I really want to explore.
That was such an important comment. And I think, Doug, I probably take it for granted. As someone who's an NRME person, I take it for granted that it's place-based. It has to be place-based. But it's so important for us to talk about that, because part of what we're tapping into, and it goes back to Lyall's comment as well, is in fact people's relationship with country and with place and their desire to look after that place. And I think you will have all seen that in your work. So wonderful to make that comment. And also for us to remember we need to be explicit about that now. Because I've had that conversation with people creating environmental markets, for example, who see it almost like a factory that's delivering widgets that you can sell off to someone. And don't sort of think, it actually doesn't work like that with the environment, does it? Like, it actually is in place. You actually can go out and stand in the environment and stand in that place, and you must understand that place. And it's not divorced from that place, just as our relationships to that place aren't. Likewise, biodiversity in that sense isn't. But what's really interesting is for those of us who work in this, that's so damned obvious that in a sense we don't always make that explicit. But I think we need to be making that explicit to be avoiding some of the perverse or potentially perverse outcomes of environmental markets and some of this work that we're doing. So thank you, Doug, for that. We only have a few minutes for our panel discussion before we segue onto questions, and I see there's a lot there that will challenge me to go through. So one of you is going to have to waffle while I try and work my way through the questions. But what I do really want is, in a sense, a take-home message for people here about a lesson. And I'm sorry, it's only going to be a lesson. And I know this is hard for Stella because she's got a whole lot of them. So pick your favourite child, I'm afraid. A lesson that you've learned from the project that you think would be most useful for others. So look at it through what's going to be most useful for people here that you've learned.
Okay.
You want to start?
I can start.
Yeah,
yes.
good.
And I'm going to say these projects, and I am going to slightly cheat here by combining several together in the same point, Kate.
This is like having a whole lot of dot points under your point.
That's right, yeah. So look, these projects are taking time, and there's several reasons for this. So social licence is really important in the blue carbon space, and blue carbon is a relatively new concept. engaging with landholders in that space as well. We've been working with the Pilot Blue Carbon site land owner for the last 2 years. So there is an education process with regards to what is the clean energy regulator, what is blue carbon, etc. So there's time there. There's also complexities in the planning and approvals stages for projects too, and they vary state to state, and even within the same state they can vary from planning pathways can vary from region to region. So that's something that is taking a bit of time as well. The new blue carbon method, navigating that, we're learning a lot. So a lot of modelling requirements, hydrological modelling, engineering designs, and just interpreting that blue cam method and applying that has also taken time. So, Kate, I'm through.
Yeah, I of course didn't actually hear any of that, Stella.
That's
I will
fine.
admit because I can't multitask and read people's questions, which by the way are really good, and listen to you. So I'm really happy for another panel member to take some agency and jump in and respond to Stella with the question about what your lesson is. Rohan, why are you looking at me like that? Okay, I think that's handed over. You didn't dip your eyes. You know how you learn in class not to.
That's right. Sorry, Kate.
You made eye contact. So that means it's, yeah. What do you reckon, from the trap rock example, what's the key lesson for people?
Look, the trap rock is really insightful about how you engage a group and how that group dynamic. That, like, if you want to deliver, if you want to understand what can be done in the environment, it was like enabling a group to kind of work through that process for themselves. The NRM, SQL and that landscape was just fundamental. They had the expertise, if you like, that science. So back to that partnership kind of concept of how do you enable that group to get the expertise that they need to be able to understand the things that they can do. The unlearnt lesson, or the lesson that we're still working through, is like the capital side. So the idea behind this program is we're trying to take these farmers through and landholders through a process to help them understand what the opportunities are in their landscape. And at the same time, we're trying to actually introduce capital, different types of capital, whether it's philanthropic or or other types of financial capital, government, investor capital. We're trying to introduce that capital to potential outcomes to see how they respond. And so, because what ultimately you're trying to do is to join those dots. You want to find a way to incentivise those farmers to deliver the outcomes they've identified. And that's the lesson we haven't got to the end of, if you like, and that's the World Economic Forum biodiversity credit auction. I think will be hugely instrumental there. We were structuring this process around the Land Restoration Fund, who funded the project. We were looking to put in some projects into the last round. We just ran out of time because they announced that round too close to the end of our process. So that's kind of the lesson we'd like to learn, is like, how do we better engage with capital? But what we are seeing is that the corporates are starting to respond. We've got a pilot with McDonald's in the beef supply chain. And so we can see that there's an impulse from the likes of Coca-Cola, McDonald's, those global corporates who are having to report under international financial reporting standard number one, their climate exposure. They understand they're going to need to report on it from the start of next year, and therefore they need the carbon emissions of their farmers. So there is this impulse coming from financial reporting that corporates are going to need to respond to. So we hope to have some answers and some lessons regarding that sometime soon.
Interesting, and one sort of thinks about the lessons we're learning in other markets around integrity and the fundamental need for robust integrity mechanisms so that it doesn't all go horribly wrong. Yes, that was me getting a free one in there. Lyall, Doug, which one? Lyall, do you want to?
I'll jump in. Just on that, the lessons learned. I think with invasive species, it's really just how it, like you said before, it's a system. It's all connected. We can do everything we try to do to create resilient ecosystems, but if we don't address the number one key threat, it's not going to succeed. We're going to keep losing our species. We're going to keep seeing extinction rates continue. I think in terms of the you mentioned choosing your favourite child. Well, all of mine are terrible and cause really bad behaviour, so I can't pick a favourite. But but I think that the work that it's a common lesson from all of them, really. It's that we need to all be part of it. It's a system that involves every Australian. We can't just think, oh, the government's got this, they're handling it, because they're trying, they're doing the best they can in a difficult environment, but it's not enough, and we need to all be our own advocates for these things, and we need to manage our own farms. We need to have on-farm biosecurity that we understand, and we do it ourselves. Everyday people in cities, in urban areas, they can be part of the surveillance network looking for things, they can be aware of it. I think, in a nutshell, I think a lot of people they aren't aware of biosecurity being a massive service for the environment. They sort of tend to think of it as border security TV show and detector dogs and things. That's all really important, but it's so much more than that for environmental conservation. And it's that connectivity and how it's all connected as a system, and we're all part of it, and we can all advocate. There's an example of the eradication going on at the moment in Queensland of red fire ants. If the government withdraws funding for that, which is looking likely, they're possibly going to spread all the way through east coast of Australia. We'll have them here, we'll have them in Sydney, we'll have them in Melbourne. We have no idea how bad that's going to be. It's going to cost us millions of dollars in ongoing health costs, environmental losses. You're not going to be able to go out in your bare feet in your garden anymore. It's like all across the board. The impacts are just all connected. So I think it's something we all need to just own ourselves, is how important it is. It's not just for governments to manage.
Thank you. And I think that integrated landscape comment then is about the fact that these impacts upon agriculture and its productivity, upon environment and biodiversity, and on human well-being and recreational values, etc. So they all come together in that it's a system, stupid. Okay, Doug.
So I think, having said we need to think globally and plan strategically, my lesson is that individual actions can make a difference in the face of climate change and biodiversity loss. And the way we think of it at the Trust is that we want to keep common species common. We want them to be keeping ecosystems healthy. And every time you can help a plant or animal survive, raise another generation of young, you've made a contribution to the persistence of those species, those populations and those ecosystems. And it's not just climate change that's a pressure on those species' chances of persisting. It's invasive species, many other threats. And so I guess those individual standard management actions that we encourage landholders to take, reducing other pressures, reducing the risks of predation and competition, they all make a difference, and we should celebrate the fact that we can make that difference and just seize the day.
I almost wish we were ending with that comment. That was perfect. Can you just remember that? Celebrating the difference and seizing the day, and we'll come right back round to you at the end. Now, I am also going to do a quick lesson learnt, though there are so many, and I agree with all of those ones. And one of the ones, and there's a question that sort of relates to this, is as I've engaged with different organisations about climate and biodiversity challenges, and people have talked about these things and talked about new forms of jargon like nature-based solutions, I've had that sort of jaw-dropping experience of, yes, but that's what we do. That's what we've been doing for decades. So, for example, in regional NRM land, yes, of course we work on climate change and biodiversity loss, and with people on the ground, etc. Where have you been? Haven't you seen that we've been doing this? And it's made me realise that one of the issues as we end up working with new and different sectors who haven't been engaged is that we do have to be able to communicate all of this work that's happening out there that to us is just obvious because it's what we do, but for others is in fact new. And they have no idea. They have no idea that all of these organisations and all of these projects are out there doing this great stuff. So for me, there's also a really basic lesson about making sure that we're communicating these things with all of these other groups and sectors nationally and internationally so that they do understand and build upon the work that's already happening rather than reinventing the wheel and learn from all that we've been doing. So that for me is a really important lesson. And that means not just preaching to the choir either. That really does mean engaging more broadly. So it ends up going back to the partnership question. Okay, so it's too many questions, so I am going to do one thing and justify my decisions about which I pick. So one of my criteria, just because I do feel slightly accountable, One of my criteria here is, rather than asking the really specific questions that some of you have sent through, that are very specific, they're excellent, but very specific to a particular project, I will ask the more general questions, I'm afraid. And what I will suggest is that you ping the speakers afterwards to ask those very specific questions of them. And I think that might be the best way of handling that one. So I will jump to one of the more general questions, which follows on from that nature-based solutions comment that I've made. So that one is that, look, many of the methods and actions being developed for markets could also reduce, I think it means for environmental markets, could also reduce climate risks. So do we need to actually get the role of nature as a climate solution, so in other words, the nature-based solutions work, and as a risk mitigation tool, better recognised? In other words, that's our panel discussion, isn't it? We're talking about biodiversity and climate change. We know that the work we do, and Stella, I might go to you first on this one, the work we do on biodiversity actually does help with risk and climate mitigation. Is that being recognised sufficiently, and how can we get it better recognised?
Sure, thanks, Kate. So fantastic question. It is really big. So look.
By the way, you've got 2 minutes.
Thank you. So look, climate change and biodiversity are connected. Whether people understand that or not, I'm not quite sure we're there. I think we are moving towards that a bit more. And the more demonstration that we can do that, the more we can connect through on both of these issues. You won't necessarily, by implementing climate change projects, you need to think about the biodiversity gains in that, but you also need to think about your outcomes and what you want to achieve as well. So that early planning, so that you are planning for both together. So, yeah.
Does anyone else want to add to that about how we perhaps elevate that understanding and that connection and the capacity for our environmental work to deliver climate solutions? Doug, Lyall?
I can try. I think something that we find is successful with the advocacy work that we do in the Invasive Species Council is understanding what communications work with different age groups, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. So it's interesting, I know I'm going to be talking about biosecurity, but I think it's transferable, is that we did some focus group testing on some of the messages we were using around biosecurity, and it was pretty much across the board that pretty much nobody understood what biosecurity actually meant, which is interesting because we all know what a feral animal is. We all know about that from growing up, and we know how bad they are and the impacts they have. But understanding that word just didn't ring true with people. So I think that's something we need to understand what actually rings true with people. Talking about a lot of the carbon credits, the biodiversity, those sorts of terms are often lost on the general public, and we're in that world, so we understand it really well. It's about translating it to the general public in language they understand, I think. It's just something we've learned to really shift, and I really struggle with that because I've come from a background in biosecurity, and all of my writing and speech was very, very technical, and I'd say, blah, 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 biosecurity frameworks and national agreements and everything, just they hear static, it doesn't mean anything. So you've got to really go to that grassroots way of language for everybody because they don't know, they're not involved. So, yeah.
I think Amanda made some really good points about that too today on the panel as well. So yeah, thank you for emphasising that. Look, I'll move on to another question, which is an interesting one. It's actually been directed specifically at you, Doug, so maybe if you kick off, but I actually think it is more relevant across the board. And it's a really good point, which is climate change, both climate change itself, but also the impacts of climate change is not the same across our landscapes or across our species and ecosystems. So how on earth do we figure out what our priority is? How do we decide where we're actually going to invest our efforts, given that variable impact of climate change and the variable response to climate change in the environment? Do you want me to waffle on a bit, Doug, so that you can think about that? Because I've got plenty I can say, but...
No. I mean, it's a big question, and thank you. So, from my perspective, as a nature conservation organisation, we continue to focus on where we think we can best maintain healthy ecosystems and species. We're factoring climate change into that in a range of ways. So we've mapped a series of refuge landscapes across Victoria based on the resilience of those ecosystems to model climate change in terms of temperature change and rainfall change. Similarly, in coastal ecosystems, we've tried to model where we think private land habitat will be protected from sea level rise in the next 70 years. But as I said earlier, I think there are so many pressures other than climate change itself, which we need to deal with globally and as a collective group of citizens. So we continue to focus on maintaining ecosystems and species, and that still means tackling these other pressures. Increasingly, obviously, like many organisations, we're moving into the restoration space as well, understanding that that's a really important contributor to both climate change mitigation, but also indeed to restoring habitat in a world where 80% of private land habitat's already been lost in Victoria.
Add something quickly? I think something just to complement what you've just said is in terms of when you're looking at invasive management, looking at the threat abatement side of it rather than the recovery part is really critical. So yeah, if you're looking at addressing the threat, that's where you get real outcomes in terms of the broader picture, you know, the regional approach, more than just a single species at a time or a single assemblage at a time. That's just
and hence also a landscape approach.
Exactly.
It goes back to threatening processes, reducing threatening processes. Those threatening processes might be further away than etc. Yes, so some of the fundamental principles of, once again, doing integrated landscape management. Did either of you want to comment, or shall I move on?
Just one thing that comes to mind is that it depends on where the capital comes from. There's kind of this interaction between capital and the expertise, if you like. And so while you know, our side of the table might have, well, I don't personally, but you guys have expertise with respect to the environmental outcomes that we want to achieve. From a capital perspective, if you're talking to corporates, for example, they're responding to a particular need, you know, their financial reporting, if you like, whereas, you know, governments have a public benefit kind of good. So it's depending on the role, the capital will kind of depend on the kind of the outcomes that will be delivered.
Which is why we need really good government frameworks and public frameworks setting up and guiding, which is also a comment that came through on the panels this morning and one we've talked about before, guiding that private investment so that it isn't ad hoc and we don't end up with just a hell of a lot of koalas. Let's be honest, as opposed to bugs. Because it's not just bad bugs, it's good bugs, you know? And are we getting private investment into looking after our good bugs, or dare I say, you know, soil microbiota, or as someone who's particularly partial to snakes?
No, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, so we actually need a coherence and guidance on that when we're creating or working to create markets to ensure that happens. I'm glad you're nodding. Thanks, Rohan.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's relief. Does anyone want to pick up on that before I go to the next question?
I might just add one thing. That's a really interesting point that you've just raised about the appropriateness of the funding sources as well. And I think that that's really important with invasive management and biosecurity, is that there are some services in biosecurity that it's not appropriate for certain funding sources to support. And we have a lot of talk at the moment about sustainably funding the system, and who do we charge? You know, who's going to pay for it? Somebody's got to pay for it. And at the moment, you know, you have the equitable principles of the risk creator should be charged first, then the beneficiary of the system next, and then the general public as a public good third. And usually that's not done the way it should be done. So we want to really be pushing for that equitable approach to getting the funding for these services that benefit all. And
I think it goes back to that comment, and Andrew Peterson was talking about this a bit too, about what guides that investment. And it's not just being able to monitor, but it's knowing where the hell you're heading and why you're heading there, that should be guiding it. So we need those really robust frameworks from the public side, in a sense, to then help guide that. Anyway, that's clearly another little soapbox of mine. So let's move on to the next question. That's the joy of being allowed to chair, isn't it? The next question is a really good one, and I suspect that all of you will have some answers to this, as do I. And that's, is science about future impacts of climate change accessible? And is it being used to inform on-ground decisions? If so, how? And if not, what the hell do we do about it? Sorry to the question writer, you didn't quite write down the what the hell do we do about it bit, but I think that's important. So the science of climate change and its impacts, are we using that in the work we do? Yep. And then more detail if you're not.
I'll be really quick. Certainly in the
yeah, and by the way, that's gone really big and orange. So you have about 1 minute each.
I feel like you're going to blow up. There's definitely a countdown. Certainly
someone get out those little plier things and turn it off.
in the track block, clearly we had a group of farmers who needed expert support. And the way the program was structured was that they had a budget that they could go spend on getting expert support. So they had that sense of agency again. But certainly the expertise that we're able to get from SQL, Southern Queensland Landscapes, who were experts in that.
Who were one of our NRM guys, just to let you know.
Yep. So was fundamental to be able to help those farmers understand. One other point, there was a light bulb moment for us. Another one where we had a field trip and that made it real. For those farmers participating because they were seeing, touching, smelling.
But what about future impacts? You have 20 seconds. Did you actually bring in science on the future impacts of climate? Okay, Stella, future impacts.
Sure. So look, in the blue carbon space, obviously looking at sea level rise scenarios across various regions is really important, and that information is being used in some sectors and not in others. So obviously we're using it from a planning perspective, looking across Australia, where are the opportunities in terms of blue carbon, but obviously in some areas of Australia that will be flooded, it's had no impact on land values, as an example. So we, so question there, because that's what we are competing against with regards to restoration projects, particularly if we want to protect long term, and also with our restoration projects as well. So in some areas it's being used, and in others not yet. They've got a bit to catch up on.
It's interesting, isn't it? The real estate market is not necessarily taking into account future impacts. What is that with regard to risk? Okay, Doug or Lyall?
Yeah,
20 seconds again.
No worries. I think part of how we approach the different invasive issues that we work on, we always try to base it on the science. And there is a lot out there. There's a lot of research that's been done on feral animal impacts and biodiversity. There is less on the climate change, I have to admit, but it is happening. I think where I would say it's not being done enough is the future, looking at what threats are on the horizon. We have a pretty short list of environmental pests that we're looking out for. It's not comprehensive. We haven't done the research to find out, what impact would they have if they got here, how are we going to address them, what technologies do we have, what technologies do we need that we don't have. I think that's a real gap that we need to be focusing on here to prepare ourselves for the increased pressures.
That's really good the way you sped up just then. Doug?
I'll just say
sorry, it's gone red now, everyone.
I think the science is there. The nexus between climate change impacts and biodiversity loss isn't there, particularly at a community level in terms of a communication Lyall talked about earlier. To me, that's a big challenge to take forward.
So I should do a quick shout out. NESF, the National Environmental Science Program, actually has a Resilient Landscapes Hub and a Climate Systems Hub. And there are some projects that are happening across those two hubs that are really relevant to this topic. And this is also about making sure that research and that work is accessible. And just a quick 2 seconds of mourning for the National Climate Adaptation Research Facility that was doing a great job at helping regional NRM organisations and others actually incorporate an understanding of climate change impacts and the need for adaptation into our regional NRM planning and into our on-ground works. So that was a real shame that we lost a really capable institutional research capacity that was engaging incredibly well with on-ground people and practitioners like us. So that's just sometimes we do great and then we ruin it. So I didn't want to end up on a bad note there. So our new Nest landscape, Resilient Landscapes and Climate Systems Hub, we hope will engage with us. And we're going to quickly go back to you, Doug, for your one line, because we're now in the red and it's about to explode, your one inspirational line that was actually going to re-motivate us all to face this challenge.
So my one individual line is that individuals can make a difference, and we actually just need to act more assertively and seize the day.
Thank you. Now, because it hasn't blown up yet and no one's actually kicking us off, I don't think Jeanette's here with her, pushing us off. Does anyone else want to do an inspirational line? Oh, she's out. No, she is kicking us off. Yeah, okay. We'll be polite and we'll end there. But thank you all very much. And I'm very sorry I didn't get to all your questions.